Merry Christmas Carol by Melinda Curtis. Chapter 1. Yay! Carol is home! Carol is home! Carol DeMerritt might have blushed if anyone had been out on the streets of Christmas Town to witness her mother and aunt doing a touchdown dance on their front porch, waving handfuls of tinsel like cheerleading pom-poms. Lacking an audience, Carol stopped humming the chorus from I'll Be Home for Christmas and got out of her car to appreciate the show. Carol's home! Carol is home! The middle-aged welcoming committee wore matching elf outfits, fuzzy pink slipper socks, gray sweats, baggy red sweatshirts with sparkly Christmas trees, and shoulder-length, frizzy gray-brown hair that needed both a cut and a color. Instantly, Carol knew what she was getting them for Christmas: gift certificates to the local hair salon, Carol's and Curls. The women who'd raised her didn't pamper themselves enough. Carol's home! Carol's home! They were attempting chorus line kicks. The Rockettes would be appalled at their lack of rhythm. Carol was comforted by their cheesy display. She'd driven all the way from South Philadelphia, feeling as if her toes would never thaw and she'd never smile again. But now she felt as warm as spring and couldn't stop a smile from blooming on her face. Carol's home! Carol's home! Mom and Aunt Sue rolled the tinsel round and round their hands, building up to a big finish. Carol's home! Tinsel flew everywhere. Laughter filled the late afternoon air. And it was just like old times. Mom and Aunt Sue beating the doldrums from Carol with a big whack of the silly stick. With the gloomies beaten back, Carol carried her suitcase up the snowy walk, past a traditional manger scene to her right and an inflatable reindeer holding a Christmas stocking to her left. The lights framing the porch glowed and the tree inside was jam-packed with ornaments, frosted with tinsel, and twinkling with lights. Carol was home. More inflatables and displays had invaded yards up and down the block, many dusted with snow. Trees glowed in windows. The sun was setting early, the way it always did this far north. Lights began to flicker on outside, white icicles, primary-colored big bulbs, Mrs. Harrington's pink racing lights, which matched her pink Barbie Jeep with Santa at the wheel. Carol was home. The 30-degree temperature didn't seem so cold. Her toes, her nose, her heart, everything warmed up. Why had she waited until the Wednesday before Christmas to come home? Aunt Sue opened the door. Mom herded Carol inside. Aunt Sue slid an arm around Carol's waist, resting her head against Carol's shoulder before returning to her domain, the kitchen. Mom wrapped Carol in a fierce bear hug, smelling of coffee and fabric softener. There was Christmas music and the smell of cinnamon cookies fresh out of the oven. Carol was home. Her shoulders relaxed. Her neck felt less stiff. Her heart, well, her heart might take longer to heal. The cheery bungalow was crowded with boxes filled to the top with bags of food and wrapped gifts for Bookie's annual Christmas food drive. With so many boxes, Carol couldn't see if there were any presents under the tree or stockings hung from the fireplace mantel. How many times had her holiday taken a back seat to whatever cause her mother was championing? The joy Carol felt at her homecoming cracked. Cold seeped back into her toes, even as she told herself it didn't matter. It looks like you finished your Bookie's contribution. Without her, she'd wanted to help. Helping was what DeMerritts did. Volunteering at school. Sitting vigil with families at hospitals. Charity food and toy drives. Clean-up days along the highway. You name it and the DeMerritt women helped. And Carol had loved it. At least, until she'd reached high school and her endless volunteering got her classified as a freak. She'd wanted to stop then and there. Try out for cheerleading. Run for student council. Join the track team. Anything that would help her fit in. Anything hadn't quite worked. She'd sprained her ankle attempting a triple jump. She'd lost in the primaries. Been cut at cheerleading tryouts. Mom had accused Carol of being selfish, because her activities had cut into her volunteering activities. Carol had fired back with some nasty assessments of her mother as a parent. None of their arguments mattered, because Carol stopped trying to do anything extracurricular. She'd returned to being the good volunteer soldier and in typical teenage fashion had thought her life was over. She'd hunkered down and hid through most of the high school experiences other students reveled in. But when she'd left home for college, dragging her feet, if truth be told, she'd discovered dozens of people just like her, people who wanted to make the world a better place, people who put others first 24/7. Freak? Nah. Carol was normal. What a relief that had been. She'd been energized. She'd double majored in college, qualifying to teach elementary classes and upper grade math, because she'd set her sights on teaching in a third world country overseas. And she would have, too, if Mom hadn't been diagnosed with an aggressive form of breast cancer as Carol was finishing her student teaching. Instead of spreading the DeMerritt love overseas, Carol had returned to Christmas Town to teach elementary school. And she'd come to see Christmas Town in a different light. Or maybe the town saw Carol differently. Not the odd girl out. Not the shy girl overlooked in the corner. For the first time, Carol felt the town embraced her passion for giving. But her relationship with her mother had never fully recovered from her high school rebellion. Thankfully, Mom wouldn't let anything like the big C stop her. And when she'd finished treatment, despite the newfound allure of her hometown, Carol got restless. There were more deserving people outside the city limits. And so, Carol had left for the challenges of teaching middle school math a day's drive away in South Philadelphia, where children passed through metal detectors at the school steps, policemen were on staff, and teachers had panic buttons. She enjoyed giving kids a love for equations and logic, which could be more reliable than their home life. She created a club for Mathletes and believed she was making a difference. And then disaster struck last weekend. We've been hard at work for bookies. Mom picked up a box and set it on top of another. She'd given Carol her wavy brown hair, soft gray eyes, and two straight nose, along with a strong sense of community. There were so many families in need this year, we decided to fill a lot of boxes ourselves before the bookies meet tomorrow. The bookies were the local book club. Carol kept up with their selections in their newsletter. This month they were reading Christmas at the Comfort Food Cafe, which sounded like something Carol should be reading. She'd been eating comfort food ever since she'd heard the news about her students. Carol shrugged out of her heavy coat and began humming the chorus of Hard Candy Christmas under her breath. I'll be fine and dandy? Hot chocolate? Aunt Sue called from the kitchen where she was hand-washing dishes. She was the spitting image of her twin, except shorter. You'll need a pick-me-up before we head over to the town square. We're putting up the stage for the Christmas pageant tonight. Ah, the reason Carol hadn't driven north until today jogged back into her memory. She'd been hoping the stage would have been put up by now, because that meant she'd avoid seeing Mike Hopkins. Mike was everything that was good and bad about Christmas Town. His family owned the local lumber yard on the outskirts of town and chipped in during emergencies and holidays. Mike was everything Carol hadn't been in high school: class president, a college-recruited athlete, the most popular boy in school, at least in her estimation. Plus he'd had a brain. He could have been a mathlete. He could have moved on from cliquish crowds and changed the world. Instead, he was Carol? Aunt Sue held a dripping mixing bowl. Did you hear me? About hot chocolate? I'm fine. Carol pushed pause on sad Christmas tunes and feel sorry for the class nerd Christmas Town recollections. I had coffee an hour ago. Her mother brushed Carol's brown hair off her shoulders. You need a Christmas Town holiday and a happy birthday. Which happened to be Christmas Day. I'm looking forward to the festivities, Carol allowed. From Thanksgiving to Christmas Eve, Christmas Town did the holiday right, and drew locals and tourists eager to immerse themselves in the season. There were traditional and over-the-top decorations on businesses and the renowned Christmas Tree Lane, Victorian carolers, street performances, and everything you could think of to make the season happy and bright: gift shops, specialty eats, and specialty treats. Beginning on Thanksgiving, Santa arrived on the town square at 3 p.m. in a horse-drawn sleigh. He handed out candy canes, listened to wish lists, and posed for pictures. Everything culminated on Christmas Eve with an annual pageant and the rush of young lovers to share a kiss beneath the town square gazebo. Local myth had it that a gazebo kiss foretold a wedding before the end of the new year. Beyond singing in the annual pageant in elementary school, a mandatory rite of passage, Carol had never been on the stage other than to construct it. Nor had she ever been kissed under the gazebo. Idyllic childhoods and happily ever afters weren't part of the DeMerritt DNA. That, at least, was something she shared with her disadvantaged students. Carol resumed humming. I'm barely getting through tomorrow. Mom was studying Carol like a nurse looking for battle wounds on a stretchered warrior. Some people were good at conversation. Carol was good at smiling. She smiled at Mom, ignoring heavy hearts and cold toes. I just need to change and then I'll be ready to go. That's my girl. Mom hugged her, more tenderly than before. Get your long johns on and let's get going. You can tell me what's bothering you on the way over. Carol widened her eyes and her smile, channeling 7th grade innocence, which was probably the last time she'd put one over on her mother. Nothing's bothering me. Liar, liar, pants on fire. Mom scared and grabbed Carol's suitcase. You'll feel better after you help someone. The family motto. It should have been etched in the mantle and printed up on the DeMerritt's holiday greeting cards. It had gotten Aunt Sue through a nasty divorce 20 years ago and Mom through chemo 6 years ago. You'll feel better after you help someone. Those words had to be able to get Carol through a crisis of confidence. Didn't they? I think we told you we finally turned your bedroom into an office. Mom hurried down the hall. Her gray sweats hung straight off her hips, as if she'd lost weight. We debated forever between a daybed and a sofa sleeper. Guess who won? Aunt Sue cackled from the kitchen. She'd ran cross-country in high school and college. She didn't like to lose, not even to the kids she played Uno and checkers with at the community center. Sometimes it's better to lose a battle. Mom opened the door to Carol's old room and set her suitcase inside. Put on your warmest clothes. It's going to get nippy after the sun goes down. She locked Carol up in a hug and held on tight, swaying from side to side as she whispered, "I'm so happy my Merry Christmas Carol is home." That nickname, Mom's weight loss and emotion-choked whisper, looped like a noose around Carol's throat. "Are you okay?" Carol whispered back hoarsely. Her question unlocked the hug. Mom retreated, sing-song ing over her shoulder, "I can't complain." Liar liar pants on fire. Fear prickled Carol's skin beneath her thick white cable knit sweater. Had the cancer come back? Or was Mom trying another radical, good-for-you diet? Her mother disappeared into the master bedroom, shutting the door with a decisive click. That was no diet-caused retreat. Carol's toes stung as if frostbit. She turned in the doorway of the room she'd grown up in, not recognizing it. Gone was the quilt she'd made from Christmas t-shirts, the quilt she was supposed to have donated but couldn't let go of. The walls no longer had community service ribbons pinned above the window. Her bulletin board with its pinned thank you notes. Gone. All gone. Something deep inside Carol panged. She hadn't realized until now that she'd needed some of that childhood innocence, some of that community appreciation, some of those past successes. Well, the quilt hadn't been the success Mom and Aunt Sue had wanted. But since it was gone, it would be nice to think it was keeping some kid warm and helping them dream of a special holiday. Carol sat on the sage-green sofa sleeper. It was as hard as the playground pavement in South Philly. A worn red felt stocking was draped across one arm. It was too old to have gone into one of the donation boxes, too unfamiliar to have belonged to the DeMerritt family. She picked it up and something inside jingled. Carol reached in, expecting to find an old forgotten toy or moldy chocolate balls. Instead, her fingers found crisp paper, a square of red and white striped stationery and written in bold green felt pen, "Choose people who choose you." Carol crumpled the paper and threw it toward the trash can. It bounced off the rim and settled on the floor, as defeated as Carol felt. Chosen? She was the girl most likely to be overlooked when it came to reindeer games. She'd poured her heart and soul into her students, trying to give kids without much hope for the future the belief that they could shape themselves a better life, with a little effort. But her mathletes had chosen to follow someone else and look for shortcuts. Carol's stomach clenched. Hurry up and change. Aunt Sue poked her head in the doorway. It takes a village to make Christmastown shine. She was gone before Carol thought to ask whose stocking she held. Chapter 2. Hurry up, son. Lots to do. There's always lots to do at Christmas. Shy of a humbug. He pushed his dodging tourists bustling for special Christmas finds. He counted the days until Christmas Eve. Most people. The big countdown for him, being Stuart Hopkins, was the Christmas town pageant on the 24th. Not even if he wanted to. It's not enough time, like they planned to tonight. Mike wove his way and a quartet of Victorian carolers, who were singing a rest. There was something he didn't get enough of from mid-November. Mike, Dad and his volunteers had set up the wooden booths, workshops and dotted the closed roads around the square. Paint. Now it was time to put up the stage. Thick low clouds. The wind chilled exposed. Michael, did you remember your tool bag? Dad held up better than the baby Callie Galloway was pushing a. Only was Dad wearing a snow bib, but he also had on his lower torso was tucked in a sleeping bag. Yeah, Dad's managing stage setup. He was his father's. They were going to be outside for hours. He was warm. The decorations and vendor booths stage was only constructed days before the pageants were divergent in their predictions of the storm's path to the south. And since he oversaw stage erection to him, one man braved the freezing temperatures, whistling jingle bells. Nick Banning made for the huge stage by stamping down snow. He was best customers. Mike greeted Nick and reversed the chair over it and backed the rest of the way to the so he could manage the proceedings. Looks like our crew snowy one. More will come. The enthusiast smiled. Of course, they will. It was Chris, used to the snow. Grandpa Wally backed the blade with the wooden pieces of the stage platform. Two plywood, filled with all the hardware. The stub wrapped around his pale wrinkled face and a thick blue knit cap. Widower, Grandpa lived with Mike and Stuart, an retirement home. The sky was turning dark and the holiday glowed a warm holiday welcome. The Victorian claws. A child's laughter drifted across the town to kiss beneath the mistletoe. Too early. gazebo for wedding bells to ring in the new year. And tugging at Mike's knit cap. Are you sure we shouldn't wait until glanced at the threatening sky above? Now's the time. None. Not surprising, since he'd been doing the rehearsal beginning Friday. Rehearsals were never up now, or we'll be digging the town square out just to put in the laminated stage plan in his gloved hand, frame pieces and trusses. Dad was into legit figure things out in advance. Snow or no, Grandpa Wally turned on the spotlight attached to the truck. Nick patted his flat stomach and gave a mighty friend would still be laughing hours from now. Sam across the town square with the frame and trusses that critically, as well, stage frame on top. The stage area was now lit up brighter than the decorating business across the street. Grandpa Wally. Hey, Lynn. Dad's grinning like an adolescent. Here come the DeMerritts. Stuart counted the twins among his favorite them. As for Mike, they were a constant reminder. He waved his hand to greet them and joined Sam. Watch out, fellas. The sound of a drill revving. That was Lynn, the taller of the DeMerritt twin parka with white trim. A red knit cap with her twin sister Sue wore the same red and white parka. She opened the rear hatch of the SUV. I brought warm for those who need a little extra to warm their insides, especially since it looked as if the storm had scared away most of them. Nick gave the woman a thumbs up. Jean out in the dark and she wouldn't have brought brandy. But her kitchen was hard won. She baked a lot of treats. I ran the teapot, a coffee shop and bakery. Lynn's going to outwork me, Sam admitted. A year. And she'll challenge us to a section buildings. And beat us. Sam's smile indicated a challenge would be just what they needed to get the work done. Mike grabbed the end of a stage frame crossbar and hailed a third woman exiting the white SUV. His back stiffened and his stomach knotted. In the same crowd. She'd spent her high school years to a football game. He'd been the quarterback. High schoolers somehow found cheap beer. He'd been taken Whitney Carlisle, who was married to his cousin. I pulled in less than an hour ago. A cream cable knit cap and matching scarf, and they seemed tinged with sadness. But what characteristic DeMerritt warmth. She hugged Stuart Green without looking at Mike directly. I was immediate from your mother and aunt. Mike's dad chuckled, adoration. When had that happened? His father's. Now, you all know the drill. Place stage frame first. The truck and trailer was sent home to keep warm with a minimum of complaints. Snowfall. Dad put them into teams. Nick with his old school, pairing a man with a woman. Mike and Carol would carry them sections. After the church group let out down the block. Mike and in agreement. They didn't talk. Not ever. Been paralyzed and his mother had died. Or that other Carol in school. And then his parents had been for his high school graduation. Mom had died during the long hours Dad had been in surgery. The DeMerritts, including Carol, had arrived at the hospital. They'd brought food, coffee, everything. The weather. The number of holidays, price of lumber. Years later, Mike would be moment he'd resented their presence. He wore his letterman's jacket with pride. He was a guy's, but, oh, how he wanted to cry. The doctor had told Uncle Jerry that his chance and shout and scream and shed some tears. He'd snapped his hand free of Aunt Dee Dee's clasp. Carol. Compassion was an emotional crutch. And then hours later, the doctor had come into Mike had felt. I'm hopeful, he'd said to Carol. Without a word, without a glance, again, the doctor said. Mike hadn't known if that Mike's hand, just once, a tiny tremor of shared, tore through the bindings inside Mike. He lost grief. Those messy emotions? They all wouldn't lift him. In shouts. In the complete correct terms or the feelings of others. He'd told he really meant Carol. The last thing he wanted was Mike, Uncle Jerry had said, stepping forward, reaching for him. Mike waved her off. For a moment, he'd thought it was his mother's voice, still holding his left hand. In the tidal way through this. Carol's voice. It consoled his heart. You'll fight the same way you fight your way to walked away without looking back. He'd felt her wood and made him feel ashamed. He hadn't talked to her, bumped into her at a party. Once the weather clears, we'll get the curtains and the lights out of storage, the lights and sound this year. Which was great since Gab to make sure electronics worked properly. Despite they all took a moment to admire their work. The church's dad, Nick, Sam, the DeMerritts, under castle turrets 20 feet above the stage. Carol stood a few feet behind Mike, humming Blue Christmas time. Depressing ones. Mike Lynn climbed the steps and tap danced her way across the stage. Holy moly. We've got trouble. Mike was the first to reach her and inspect the plow snow. It was soft, as if it had gotten wet, painted wood with alarming ease. How had they not? Too cold, too snowy. What I assign a mid-sentence shiver. He'd been out too long. Before someone fell through the stage. Mike had some No one step on this. Using his screwdriver, your wish. Lynn tap danced her way back the stairs to join Lynn, and together the twins' bad would probably never be performed during the Christmas. Dad clapped and laughed. Nick and Sam looked. Mike was happy that someone still had the warmth and, in a moment of weakness, his glance kindly, as if Lynn and Sue were her children, not urgently at Mike, as if she thought he needed a kind word. For a moment, all he saw were her soft gray eyes. Her gaze was tinged with that sadness he'd first, as if they held something precious, and his chest filled with something. Not tap, want to sing, in the shower, Carol, and raced toward the gazebo. Who cared if it was ways away? He didn't need softness. He needed her of a paraplegic and an 80-year-old grandfather. Lumber. Well, mostly Mike ran the lumber yard. It started to snow harder. Big fat passing Christmas town by. Let's load up the tool once more. She was scooping up her mother's drill. His chest absent of longing. Best get some months. We'll be shoveling tomorrow. Chapter 3. Tossing the old Christmas stocking on the floor, Carol pulled out the sofa sleepress. Her wet snow pants and jacket were hanging and tossed on the tile in the front foyer. She was bone tired from lifting, carrying, holding a cold body. Not only had the temperatures been he'd been so cold to Carol, she'd wished kind Mike was to his father, how inclusive Mike and manager. She'd noted the lines of fatigue Mike to care for his father without any help. His instruction, and Aunt Sue had taken the stage with Carol. How thin and pale Carol's mother was. Mom came in her bedroom and opened the closet. Along with folded sheets and a pillow. Carol's innocent joy of holidays past. Mom laid the near Carol's legs. She'd taken a shower and more prominent. The hollows in her cheeks weren't as fleet. Betrayals were nothing compared to her mother's dying to dote on her child. Carol loved her nonetheless. His voice was upbeat, cheerful even. It's time. Wanted to avoid the truth? Carol turned her face. Socialize between them about this. Settle down? Students of yours disappointed you. Mom was good at diet, but she knew Carol well enough to guess. And her own, it would hurt, but not as much. Naughty seemed to cave in on itself, instinctively trying Carol's support group. It's hard to reconcile yours, and then took back your maiden names. Carol. He'd remarried and lived on the West Coast. But I had you, Mom said softly. Carol's the cold she'd been feeling in her limbs spread through the truth. This isn't about me finding someone to hold me when you're gone. Carol drew a shuddering breath, nearly falling off the arm of the sofa. I'm rolled into a sitting position and took her mother's hand. Mom's lips trembled. I don't want to be shed tears. I found out a week ago. Cancer had spread to organs. This was bad. Carol came to her knees and hugged her mother, never wanting to. You'll make me feel as if this is the end this time. The end. There was no way Carol was going to go back. Does Sue know? Mom's laugh was a frayed chord. Twins always do. She pushed Carol's without easing out of the hug. I wanted to wait until after Carol's birthday on Christmas Day. She was too familiar with death. She knew it wasn't someday soon any easier to bear. Grief pressed. Mom stroked her hair and crooned, my sweet Sue. But you, I worry about you being alone. Paper, too weak and flimsy to put up a fight. Oh. Asterisk Michael. Mike was buried deep. Michael. Something bumped against the wall outside. He'd just fallen asleep. The covers fell to his wing. I'm coming. He tugged on a pair of jeans. What's wrong? What happened? Dad sat in his look on his face. 3 feet of snow. Age. Mike ran a hand over his face, glancing. They'd gotten home after midnight. Need shoveling or the main floor will collapse. During the snowstorm. He spun around in the kitchen behind him. I made the decision to put the stage up. It was on Mike, who sighed. The linoleum would be colder in the darkness. And he had a full 10 with J.B. Montgomery about a contract to was building this spring. The order would mean Mike could house. Hans Sigmund had ordered lumber to convert to his barn this afternoon. Patrick Harrison's, his new siding was supposed to be delivered by the manufacturer. He had the time to get out to the stage and shovel, clean up, open the yard and look presentable for I'll go. You'll call me when you get there? Dad for the living room, which had a small Christmas tree on a what? Of course. Mike was out slapped him awake. Had Dad said there was 3 and it was still snowing. Mike moved quickly to the north front, a costly investment, but one that paid off room. They were just far enough outside of town. He drank coffee while he let the truck warm up. House, checking the latest weather report, 6 to reassure himself that the stage would be fine. And it was on to town and the town square, plowing. Mike parked in front of the stage and turned the spotlight on. Lapsed. The bad news was, a lone figure off the stage. Carol had beaten him here. Green. Mike tucked his aversion away. She had to be happy about that. Mike called his father when Mike plodded through the waist-high drifts, thinking about that pause to greet him, gray eyes still filled with that Mike collapse. Same as my dad. The note shovel handled tightly as he surveyed the rest of the stage and stiff. His stomach didn't ache. There was lack of control. Twice. Go back to bed. She still felt awkward with him. I've got this. And raised to let a woman do physical work. When his 2x4 for a customer as Dad was. Help. After blazing a trail through the drift stay away from the bad patch. She mumbled something more. Was she referring to him? No. Recently. Possibly hoodwinked in the pursuit of one of the kind of anger that simmered because it had no target. So, he said nothing and began shoveling. Shovel. The echo of boots. The huff of bongs. A memory flitted past. Carol. Boys gathering round and calling her names like Yule's, Merry Christmas Carol. They weren't bad, Nick. He'd made her cry. We're even. His stomach. That was wrong. Carol hadn't made him, but there was no excuse or reason for the following news with many of his friends. They'd been at a party but the parties their classmates had thrown before. boots, blue jeans, and a thick white cable knit shoulders. She mingled and laughed with Mike's friends as lurking in a corner, feeling like an outsider because of his decision to take a gap year before starting college. When the countdown to midnight had begun, think of was the warmth of Carol's hand, softness of her voice, grief. When she'd held him, things hadn't seemed the surprise on her face, the dim lights, before kissing her at the stroke of midnight. But she was also the woman he'd heard in the hospital with his tears. Pride made him release her and walk away. Came home every holiday season. Is this a losing bet? Her dark lashes lined with snowflakes. They were cleared before Mike arrived. No. It's a whole lot. If we can get it clear enough to fix this to the soft spot in the middle of the stage. Mike back to Carol, their butts bumped. He stumbled perhaps in an ill-fated attempt to catch him. Crack fell as if in slow motion, which was slower than his stumble on top of him, working its way at the back of his neck. It's heavy. Weight. Not just snow had fallen. Mike couldn't draw a breath. Her back was pulling him. I'm okay. I'm okay. That her well-padded hips and squeezed and ow. He hadn't lifted her to the stage, but at least her push. Sharp pain lanced through his wrist once. Oh, no. You're hurt. Carol scrambled. She turned on her stomach and reached for him. Mike stood. The stage was 3 feet tall on top of him. Oh. She hadn't remembered again. Normally, hopping onto a 3-foot tall no gear and down a healthy wrist. Reluctantly on top of him again. Instead, she yanked hurt. Fingers? Hand? Wrist? Back. Ow. He'd sprained a lot of body parts. Not that he wanted to be a wimp about it, but knows. Bad idea. Come on. We'll take your truck. I can drive myself home. Home, Mike. Her voice wasn't angelic. We're going to the hospital. I don't need a hospital. A little ibuprofen. And he'd be good as new, in a breath. The fact that you can't be your normal veins gamble. She dug into his jacket pocket for his key. Chapter 4. Mike Hopkins wasn't a happy camper. He wasn't happy the emergency room was empty. He wasn't happy to be seen right away. He was practically depressed that Carol was correct and he needed an X-ray. Carol settled in for the long haul, waiting for the orthopedic specialist to put Mike in a cast. She texted her mother not to worry, and tried not to worry about her mother. But apprehension buzzed between her ears like the white noise she played on her phone when she had trouble falling asleep. She shed her snowsuit and sat at Mike's bedside, humming along to the Christmas music playing over the speakers and trying not to stare at Mike. When she'd first seen him last night, she hadn't wanted to get out of Aunt Sue's SUV. Broad shoulders that could carry any load. Muscular arms and legs from the demanding work at the lumber yard and care for his father. Bright brown eyes that could see everything. Mike looked like a man who knew his place in life and could roll with the punches. What if he looked down on her the same way he had after he'd kissed her on New Year's Eve? As if he'd drank too much and mistaken her for someone else? In reality, he'd barely acknowledged her at all. Mike had been a rock star in high school. A great athlete. Not gorgeous, but good-looking with a confidence that made him handsome. He was really good at science and math, enviably better than she'd been. It came easily to him, which was good since he seemed to care more for his athletic pursuits. His truck had been old, but the cool kind of old. In short, Mike had IT. God status. Carol had had none of IT. She'd been in the throng of student also-rans. The nerds, the less pretty, the passionate about something not cool. You know, the remaining 90% of the student population. She'd be lying to herself if she denied having a crush on Mike, who'd been in her math classes all 4 years. She'd be lying to herself if she pretended he'd ever noticed she was alive after the 4th grade schoolyard spectacle of Merry Christmas Carol name-calling. After his parents' accident, he'd treated Carol the same way he'd treated her while building the stage last night, never looking her straight in the eye and never speaking directly to her. Logically, she knew it was grief, but there was still a tiny corner of her heart that wished he'd see her and see her differently. And then she'd come home after her first term and run into some of her classmates at the teapot. Going away to college had given Carol some undeserved cash. Becky Usted had invited her to Cliff's New Year's Eve party. Carol had surprised herself when she'd decided to go. She'd spotted Mike inside right away, hanging out in a corner with his football buddies. Occasionally, his laughter would drift to her between songs, but it didn't sound genuine and his smile seemed forced. Her heart went out to him. But she didn't dare approach. She spent the night catching up with friends. And then the countdown had begun. Couples formed. Friends clustered together. Carol was alone. Her chest felt empty and her gaze searched for Mike. She didn't have to search very hard. He appeared before her, drawing her into his arms for her first kiss. It was everything a first kiss should be. Tender, full of longing. But the clock struck midnight and Prince Charming left Cinderella. Carol stood immobile for several seconds, not knowing whether to be angry or hurt or flattered. Over the years, as she relived that moment, she'd felt each of those emotions in turn. And while they'd shoveled snow this morning, she'd wondered if Mike had ever realized Carol DeMerritt was the woman he'd kissed all those years ago. More likely, he'd been drunk and she'd been the first available woman he'd come across. Mike heaved another impatient sigh. He wasn't happy he'd been unable to shake his hospital chaperone. Namely, her. Geez, Carol said, blurt-like, feeling more irrelevant and unwanted than ever. Worse, she was wondering about a kiss when she should have been somberly contemplating her mother's health. You'd think you'd never broken a bone before. I haven't. Mike's whiskered jaw worked and he stared at a poster of a snow globe with Christmas Town in the center hanging on the wall. It was standard tourist fare, nothing out of the ordinary, although this one was framed. His obviously faux interest was just one more indication that Mike was miserable. And looked the part. His dark brown hair stuck straight up on top and was crushed at the nape of his neck. Add to that his unshaven chin, the dark circles under his eyes, and the sullen look on his face, and Carol had the strongest urge to climb into bed with him, snuggle up, and reassure him everything would be all right, that his first broken bone would heal in no time. Firsts are always hard, Carol said somewhat absently, still considering making a fool of herself. Mike turned a haughty stare her way, banishing thoughts of hospital bed snuggles. I wouldn't be here if you'd stayed away from that soft spot. And him. I said I was sorry. It wasn't as if she'd bumped him toward the weak spot on the stage on purpose. I can only apologize so many times. I don't want your apology. He ran a hand through his hair, which only made it look worse. I don't have time to be injured. She stood, poured a little water from the pitcher on the bedside tray in her hands, and slicked his hair into place on top. Mike froze, staring up at her with brown eyes the color of dark chocolate, gaping as if she'd overstepped. Which she had. A flush crept up her neck. She crossed her arms and tried to ignore it. She taught middle school in South Philly. She had to quit reacting to him as if she'd never left Christmastown High School. Look, if I hadn't driven you here, I'd leave you alone to wallow. But I feel responsible for you. Mike was still staring at her, thinking heaven only knew what. I could think of 100 things he's thinking, starting with that woman touched me and ending with how quickly can I get her away from me? She poured water into a cup and thrust it toward him. Drink this. Hydration is important to healing. He looked at her sideways and she assumed he was going to refuse, but instead, he took a drink. I'm not used to anyone babying me. Of all the, you took my arm when we walked in as if I was about to collapse. He sounded horrified. Did that, Mom would caution her to use a soft voice, to be as tranquil as a polished river stone confronted by a raging river. Aunt Sue would coach her to dig deep for compassion and to hang on to patience. But neither one was facing Mr. Big Ego, cranky pants. Did I bruise your male pride? His eyebrows slanted together and he stared at his splinted arm on the pillow in his lap. She had. The entry was icy. I didn't want you to slip and break anything else. Like the pride he didn't want to admit having. He rubbed a hand over his hair, destroying her handiwork. Why do you always have to be so cheerful? I'm not. Frustration welled inside her chest. Him. Her students. Her dream of being a person who made a difference. I'm not happy to be here. I'm not happy you're hurt. She flopped back in her seat. I'm not happy you're not happy. I'm for sure not happy that my students robbed my principal's house last weekend. And overshare. Plus she'd almost told him her mother was dying. Carol froze, right there in her seat beneath the hospital heating vent. Only her eyes moved, full of potential tears, shifting as if magnetized toward Mike. The lines of disapproval on his face faded. Say that last part again. Grandma got run over by a reindeer piped through the loudspeaker. Her Christmas was turning out to be just as disastrous as Grandma's. It's nothing. Nothing she wanted to talk about. It's something. And something else. Mike worked his mouth as if chewing on her denial, finally spitting it back at her. Is that what you meant this morning about not being able to tell the difference between good and bad? He'd heard her whining this morning? She was barely able to move her chin to nod. I thought you were referring to me, Mike said softly, gently, unexpectedly. Carol expelled an air vomit, sounding like a cat coughing up a hairball. You're good. Trust me. He chuckled, a sound as rich as butter brickle ice cream, her personal summer fave. The sound clung inside her chest long after he stopped laughing. And yes, that was Carol sitting in silence contemplating her high school crush's laughter and how his shoulders were strong enough to lean on in times of crisis. Did you put your faith in your students? Carol's bruised heart clenched. She had. I trusted them not to be vandals. How old are these juvenile delinquents? He smiled when he said it, softening his words. They're babies, she cried, one octave below a wail. She gripped his bedrail with both hands. 8th graders. I've had them since they were in 6th, because they excelled at math. They come from the worst neighborhood in Philly. And I thought, it didn't matter what she'd thought, because she'd failed. And now her mom, Carol swallowed thickly. You thought you could save them. He laid a hand over hers. He understood how much her student's betrayal meant to her. It was there in his sympathetic smile. In his touch. In his eyes. For a moment, Carol forgot he was Mike Hopkins, high school god, and that she was Carol DeMerritt, also ran. For a moment, they were equals. Standing on the edge of the dance floor and celebrating the new year with a kiss. All because he understood. You can't save everyone, he said, as morose as an undertaker. You should stop trying. Anne. Carol was back to also ran status. He stared at the snow globe hanging on the wall and that gazebo inside where they'd never kissed. Sometimes you have to backpedal to save yourself. Carol nearly fell out of her chair. That goes against everything I was raised to be. I know. Mike looked unhappy about that. But saving people is exhausting. You'll be an empty shell if you keep trying to change people who don't want to change. His words slammed into Carol's gut with a quick 1-2, look at you sucker punch. Carol felt dizzy. Students who didn't listen to her advice. Mothers who didn't want her help. It was demoralizing to the point of exhaustion. No wonder she'd been fantasizing about kissing Mike for the past 12 hours. He was right. Being a demerit was exhausting. It left her empty and alone. Everything he said was true. And yet, I can't stop. I won't. I know. But aren't you tired? Their eyes met, but his gaze went beyond him seeing her face. He was seeing into her soul. She felt their connection like a warm blanket swaddling her heart. Aren't you tired of bad news and setbacks and failures? If he hadn't used the F word, she might have been able to deny it. As it was, the ache in her bones turned into a sharp stab of pain, one that tried to deliver a death blow to good intentions and good deeds. But she couldn't deny who she was. She couldn't admit she was weary of good deeds being taken for granted. Not when her mother was dying. "Why are you telling me this?" Carol wasn't sure she wanted Mike to answer, so she kept on talking, venting her frustration, angry that he'd pinpointed the one thing she'd been reluctant to admit, even to herself. That she was tired and ready to stop trying to save the world. "You avoid me until you can't. You don't talk to me. You don't like me. I like you." He didn't look at her when he said it. "My BS meter is in the red zone." Carol wrapped her arms around herself. "Remember, I work with middle schoolers who tried to embellish everything from the reason for needing a hall pass to the reason they hadn't done their homework." "All right. I'll admit it." Using his legs, Mike pushed himself higher up in the bed. This time he didn't shy away from her gaze. "You make me uncomfortable." Carol couldn't find anything to say. His statement implied she had some type of power over him. She, Carol DeMerritt, the woman he'd kissed and left on New Year's Eve. Miss also ran. "Watching you, hearing about your efforts," he plucked at the pillow beneath his splint. "It makes me feel petty and small. But, you take care of your dad. You gave up a chance to play football. That must have stung." He'd gone from being prom king to lumberyard manager. "When I came home from the holidays freshman year and saw you still here, I was surprised." She didn't want to reference that night, that kiss. Let him bring it up. "Do you know why I avoid you?" Sometime after high school, he'd mastered the art of the dark look. Maybe he didn't want to talk about New Year's Eve either. His dark look had almost no effect on Carol. Early in life, she'd mastered the art of being Teflon, at least in her demeanor. "Yes, I want to know. Why had he kissed her?" "I avoid you because you were there," he said flatly, not answering anything. The night of Dad's accident." His words were nearly as brittle as his cracked bone. "You were there. You witnessed everything. You heard everything. You saw." "I don't know what you mean." Carol fell back in her chair, perplexed. "This wasn't about their kiss?" "I remember that night and how devastating it was. It was hard for me to hold it together. I kept looking at my mother and thinking, drunk driver. That could have been my mom in the operating room. Or the morgue." She shuddered, because chances were her mother wouldn't pass away suddenly without warning. And then tears filled her eyes, because good or bad, she couldn't imagine a life without her mother in it. "I was scared. I was frightened for both of us. We were just kids. 18, but still sheltered by the innocence of Christmas Town. I kept distracting myself by bringing everyone coffee and humming Christmas carols, but I couldn't understand how you could be so brave." "Brave?" He flopped back in bed, staring at the snow globe picture. "I raised my voice to a woman. I had a meltdown in front of everyone." His mouth set in a grim line. "In front of you?" He'd cried. Who wouldn't when his mother had just died and his father almost had, too? "Mike." She took his large hand, suddenly on more familiar turf. She'd been viewing him through the eyes of a besotted teen, and he'd been associating her with painful memories. She needed to take on the role of a DeMerritt. "I spent a lot of time in that waiting room as a child in support of a lot of different people. Yours weren't the worst words I ever had tossed in my direction. Not by a long shot. You hung in there until the doctor delivered the news. You needed someone to shout at. I was glad I could be there for you." On a DeMerritt level. On a high school girl level, it had been crushing. "I yelled, some pretty terrible things." His features were taut, his tone remorseful. "I've heard worse." Carol shrugged, not feeling at all like unscratchable Teflon. "Afterward, I was upset that you'd seen me cry," he said gruffly, reminding her he had an above-average dose of pride. "I'd yelled at you and you didn't shed a tear. You thought I was making fun of you? All this time?" She released his hand, gripping the bed rail. He didn't know her at all. He'd never known her. But really, what God knew and also ran. "You think I'd make fun of you when you were grieving?" Was that why he'd kissed her? As some sort of punishment? Or to try and embarrass her? "Something like that," he mumbled, staring at her hand. The chorus of White Christmas was playing in the hall. One of her favorites. She dreamed of white Christmases where a family celebrated just amongst themselves. Guilt hunched her shoulders. She loved her family. She loved to volunteer. But there'd been many Christmases where her mother had shown Carol a gift she'd asked for and told Carol she was going to give that present to a child who needed it more than Carol did. Mom wasn't the best of mothers. Carol's shoulders bent farther under the disloyal thought. Gifts shouldn't make a holiday special. Carol had the money to buy her own presents now. And if the presents she gave to Mom and Aunt Sue ended up in the stocking of someone else on Christmas morning, it was their right to give them away. If Carol was blessed with a husband and children, she wouldn't give their presents to someone else. She'd be a little selfish, if only at the holidays. Her mother wouldn't be around to argue. What a horrible, horrible thought. Carol's head dropped to her hands. What is it? What's wrong? Mike covered her hand with his. Tell me. She couldn't admit the undemerited trail of her thoughts. Instead, she lifted her head and said the first thing that came to mind. When I was in high school, I considered becoming a nun. Mike's mouth dropped open. A nurse in red and green Grinch scrubs wheeled a gurney past the open door. A nun. She nodded. It felt like I'd been trained from infancy to listen to people, to absorb their pain, to keep everything bottled up inside, and to have the thick skin of Teflon. But even the hard surface eventually wore down and cracked. I envied you the boisterous moments when you'd shout, when you'd get angry, when you'd lash out. His dark brows quirked. He didn't believe her, although she wasn't sure if he didn't believe the nun thing or the envy thing. It was suddenly important that Mike, the most popular boy in school, understood Carol, the least important girl in school. I remember watching you score a touchdown when I was a freshman. You shouted your joy. Every muscle in his body had been rigid with exultation. And then there was a time after a school rally that everyone was trying to get out of the parking lot and you were blocked in. You shouted at Donnie Hellman and honked your horn. How many times had Carol been stuck in traffic in Philly and honked, thinking Mike would approve? Mike rubbed a hand through his hair, spiking it up. That's enough. I'm starting to sound shallow. You were expressive, sensitive, open, impatient, alive. She was tired. Not just from lack of sleep, but tired from the burden of failing her students, and beaten down by her mother's news. It was as if life had been waiting for years for a moment of weakness to break through Teflon and make her wonder if she should pursue a different life. I wanted to be like you, sometimes. Now you're just trying to make me feel better. She wasn't. I'm curious. A hint of a smile played on his lips. Why didn't you become a nun? Her gaze dropped to his lips and then rebounded to the framed picture of the snow globe. Chapter 5. Why didn't you become a nun? While Mike waited for Carol's answer, he lay back in the hospital bed and closed his eyes, trying to remember if he'd been given pain pills, because he had to be imagining the things he and Carol were saying to each other. Her students had let her down? He wished he could read them the riot act. She hadn't been laughing at him? He'd never met anyone with such a giving heart. She'd been raised to comfort people in times of crisis? He couldn't fathom why any parent would want to take their child along when people were so upset they'd lash out at anyone, including a quiet, kind-hearted girl. He hadn't ever wondered what had made Carol DeMerritt such a do-gooder. What he wasn't imagining was the jolt of electricity he felt when their gazes connected, or the peaceful way he felt with her hand in his, as if their hands were meant to be joined. She'd considered being a nun? She had the temperament for it, but Mike was suddenly grateful she hadn't, because more than anything, he wanted to lean over and kiss her. What had come over him? He should be thinking about repairing the stage, his meeting with JB, his to-do list, and the reason the orthopedist hadn't shown up to set his cast. With his eyes still closed, he asked, "Do you remember why?" "Of course. You aren't going to tell me?" He opened his eyes and stared at Carol, at her soft lips pressed tightly together, at her tender gaze slanted toward the framed picture of the snow globe, the same print his mother had loved so much. "You're going to make me guess?" Carol's gray eyes widened and flew to his face. "What's taking the doctor so long?" Mike was suddenly comfortable waiting, if it meant Carol waited with him. "I'm going to guess." "Please don't." Was that panic in her voice? "I know what changed your mind." He made his words as gentle as if he was teasing his kindergarten niece. "You got stuck in traffic and yelled at someone." Her slender arms wrapped around her waist as she shook her head. Mike added a gentle smile to his attack. "You beat one of your students at Yahtzee and shouted with joy." No, his cell phone rang. He tugged it free of his pocket. "Dad. Shoot. I meant to call you. I sent Grandpa Wally over to the town square, but you weren't there." Worry rumpled Dad's words, such that he had to pause and swallow. "He said you'd gotten the stage shoveled, but that it had collapsed on that weak portion." "Yeah. About that, did you go to breakfast? Are you coming by the yard soon to get the plywood? Where are you?" His father was worried, all right. Possibly just as much about the stage as he was about Mike. "Carol and I fell through the stage, Dad." Mike talked faster, feeling like he was a teenager again and hiding something. "We're fine, but I'm getting a splint on my wrist." "A splint?" Carol raised her brow. Mike stared at the snow globe photo hung on the wall and drew a deep breath. "I should be back at the yard in about an hour." Carol made a noise that expressed her disbelief perfectly. "Hurry," Dad said. "It's snowing again." "I'll take care of everything." Mike glanced at Carol, who was shaking her head. I always do. But a broken wrist was a major complication. He had some heavy lifting ahead of him today. Now you make me sound like I don't pull my weight. Dad was in a state. I opened the yard today, you know. You're not dead weight. Still, guilt weighed on Mike's shoulders, heavier than when Carol had used him as a ladder. A doctor appeared in the doorway, wheeling a medical cart. Over an hour later and they were ready to leave the hospital. Mike's arm was in a cast and a sling, which he planned to ditch as soon as he was out of Carol's care. He had to fix the stage and get back to the yard in time for his meeting with JB. But Carol had her own pace. She helped Mike put his good arm in his jacket sleeve. She tucked the ends of the empty sleeve into his jacket pocket and zipped him in, treating him the way he did Dad. She smoothed the jacket over his shoulders, avoiding his gaze. Snug as a bug in a rug. Rolled up rugs get put in corners. Useless, in other words. I can't get through my workday like this. I'll help. She said it quietly, barely above a whisper, as if afraid he'd refuse her. Mike swallowed back a protest. His pride demanded he refuse her help, but he'd hurt Carol once before. He wasn't going to hurt her again. Besides, he wanted to know what had kept her from being a nun. He nodded. Carol reached for her snowsuit. She was thinner than the suit let on. All that padding he'd felt this morning when he'd tried to push her to safety? It was the suit. She had very little padding. In fact, she should probably eat a bit more or a bit more often. Carol led them out the door and past a now crowded waiting room. They walked out into the snow. All that snow, Mike hesitated. What's wrong? Carol gave him a quick once-over. Do you need another pain pill? No, the sun was up and the drifts were nearly as tall as Mike. How are we going to fix the stage in that? Not to mention, the storm was predicted to linger for days. So many townspeople depended upon strong holiday sales, all that snow was sure to deter tourists from coming. You'll figure something out. Carol looped her hand through the crook of his left arm. She arched her brows when he resisted being led. Don't argue. Safety first. She tugged him forward. They crossed the icy ambulance lane to the 2-foot drifts in the main parking lot. He'd never admit he liked the way she watched out for him. Carol unlocked the North Pole lumber truck, opened the door, and waved Mike in like an airplane marshal trying to park a plane at the gate. I should drive, Mike said grimly, although from a bug in the rug perspective he had limited mobility. But he hadn't been fond of Mr. Toad's wild ride the one time he'd gone to the Magic Kingdom in Florida, and Carol's driving was herky-jerky, like Mr. Toad's. I'm driving, Carol said firmly, and then she smiled. It was a simple upturn of lips, but Mike felt her smile somewhere in his chest, like a gentle touch on a wintry night, one that said, hey, I'm not going anywhere. After all, Mike, I have your keys. And Carol wasn't foolish enough to wave them in front of him. Plus your arm's in a sling. She had him, but Mike couldn't let her get away with it so easily. Your shifting is horrible. And you jumped a couple of curbs on the way over. It was dark. She shrugged, still smiling. And I'd never driven a truck with a snowplow attachment before. He liked teasing her. He liked how her gray eyes warmed when he did so. She made him forget about full to-do lists and unattainable dreams. He'd tease her now and wait for the opportunity to ask about the abandoned nunship later. You mean you've never broken a snowplow before? Firsts are hard to deal with. Carol's eyes narrowed and she pointed inside the cab again, not quite wiping the grin from her face. We can argue or you can get in. He had no choice. He got in. Carol drove them back to the lumber yard to pick up the plywood and paint for the stage. This time, she wasn't panicked about Mike being hurt or driving a stick shift while the snowplow was at ground level. She didn't jump any curbs or grind any gears. Carol turned down Garland Lane, which had several local businesses, a tile outlet, tinsel and tile, a specialty lighting shop, silver and gold lighting, a paint store, Christmas colors. Her stomach grumbled. She hadn't had anything to eat besides coffee and it was nearly 10. You didn't eat breakfast. Are you offering to make me some? Mike's deep voice filled the small cab with an invitation. Or maybe Carol hadn't had enough sleep and was imagining things. No. I was going to remind you to eat at the yard. The Hopkins men lived in a house adjacent to their business. Fueling your body helps you heal. I'm going to take you to lunch after I meet with J.B. Montgomery. The invitation was gone. In its place was an order. Words pinwheeled through her head almost incoherently. Dates. Mike Hopkins. Commands. Nerds. Reality check. Squee. She had to come down on the side of reality. She wasn't the kind of woman who got asked out by Mike Hopkins. Besides, he hadn't asked. Mike, I said I'd help you, but if you want to make sure I don't ditch this sling today, you'll let me take you to lunch at Posey's. How kind of you to ask, she deadpanned. He leaned back against the door and gave her that dark look of his. I heard your stomach growl. He'd noticed? She felt overly heated in her jacket and gloves. Carol slowed to turn into the lumber yard. The driveway gate was framed by 2 large metal poles painted like candy canes. Christmas trees were painted on either side of the front doors. I was going to get something to eat, Carol said slowly. When? Sometime, later. He directed her to park around the back. If you're not going to accept my lunch offer, you can wait in the truck. I'll be out in about 30 minutes. Carol put the car in park and stared at Mike the way she'd looked at some of her more challenging students, down her nose and with raised brows. You'd leave me out here to freeze? You could keep the motor running, he said, trying to look like an evil overlord. The effect was ruined by the upward quirk of his mouth. Are you always this bossy? My dad would say yes. Mike opened the door and climbed down carefully. The wind hurried to fill the cab with frigid air. He turned to stare at her. Not with the overlord's superiority. Not with contempt. My mom's been gone 10 years. Between taking care of my dad, grandfather, and the yard, I don't have time for pleasantries, or dating, for that matter. His words slowed. His voice dropped. I've been winged and I've got obligations that require 2 good hands. She shivered. Because of the wind chill. You stayed with me this morning when you didn't have to. His voice was no more than a whisper, as if what he had to say was for her ears only. You offered to help today without knowing what needs to be done. That means a lot to me. I want to thank you by taking you to lunch. And then he grinned. Because you may get your fill of me today and not come back tomorrow. He shut the door. He'd given her carte blanche to help him? More than one day? Carol couldn't breathe. Meanwhile, Mike was climbing the steps to the offices, which were covered in snow. He could fall at any time. And wonderful helper that she was, Carol was sitting in a parked running truck. She turned the engine off and hopped out, hurrying up the stairs after him. The main building was only about 60 by 60. It had 4 aisles filled with hardware, gardening supplies, and paint. Mike's father and grandfather waited just inside the door. There was a holiday mural painted behind the sales counter, one with a glowing castle in the background, and Santa's sleigh and reindeer flying off in the starry sky with a full load of presents. Mrs. Anderson was browsing an aisle with garden supplies. Are you okay, son? The resemblance between father and son was striking, especially when Stuart wasn't smiling. 20 years and 20 pounds ago, he'd probably been a hunk. He wore a blue flannel shirt and blue jeans. His upper body was toned and muscular, proving he didn't sit still in his wheelchair all day long. He went places in it. Was it a sprain? Did you get stitches? I've got a splint. Mike looked at Carol over his shoulder, not quite daring her to contradict him. Carol promised the doctor I'd keep my arm in a sling today. Carol shed her hat, coat and gloves. Mrs. Anderson was frowning at a pair of garden gloves. She was Carol's former principal when she'd taught here, and was bundled for a day of shopping in white snow boots, a full-length pink jacket, and a red knit cap with a white pom-pom that looked to have been made by the naughty elves. Carol thought Mrs. Anderson had 7 kids and 3 sets of grandparents to shop for, what with being on her second marriage. The principal glanced up, a question in her eyes. She didn't catch anyone's attention, other than Carol's. They exchanged mute waves. Carol tried to butt into the conversation, but Wally beat her to it. In my day, it didn't matter if you got a splint or a splinter. You kept working. Mike's grandfather was tall and broad-shouldered, but bent and wiry from his white flyaway hair to his thin lanky arms. What good is that portable phone of yours if you don't call us? Wally turned, apparently only having been interested in delivering a set down. He collapsed in a recliner behind the desk and turned on the television to a game show, elbowing a display of loose holiday balls. One fell to the floor and shattered. Blast. I'll get it. Wally lurched to his feet. Mike let his grandfather handle the mess. Last week, you told me not to call. His pain medication must have been wearing off. He sounded cranky. You said it interrupted your game shows. Mrs. Anderson put the gloves back on the rack and turned with a resigned sigh. Carol hurried to the woman's side. Welcome to the North Pole. Can I help you? But, you don't work here. Nothing got by Mrs. Anderson. Not in or out of school. I'm just helping out while I'm home. Remember, I teach in South Philly. I remember. It was our loss. We just had our 5th grade teacher give birth. I need a long-term sub the rest of the year. Mrs. Anderson leaned closer and lowered her voice. I hear teaching in South Philly is rough. Carol blinked. Momentarily at a loss for words. The idea to return and help her mother beckoned, blocked by the need to hang in Philly. Her students would see her leaving as just another adult giving up on them. But Mom needed her, even if she didn't want Carol here. Carol likes to make an impression on troubled youth. Mike picked up the gloves the principal had been considering. What can I help you with? My daughter wanted pink garden gloves, and all I see are red and green ones. Mrs. Anderson had the air of a harried shopper. Are there any in back? We had some a few weeks ago. Stuart rolled away. I'll go check the stock. Mrs. Anderson sighed, pulled out her cell phone, checked the time, and then frowned. Tick-tock. The principal wouldn't wait much longer. Who else is on your list? Carol smiled like Mrs. Anderson was still her principal and it was review day. Maybe we can knock someone else off while we're waiting. I need something for my former in-laws. The Pagets? Mike moved down the aisle and gestured they follow. I have a bird feeder kit back here. Harry could pound some nails and put it together, and Carlene could paint it. Oh, they do enjoy birds and DIY projects. Mrs. Anderson put away her cell phone and followed Mike. What a great idea. In no time, Mrs. Anderson had purchased pink gardening gloves and the bird feeder kit. On her way out, she turned to Carol. I'm serious about hiring you back. Don't leave town without talking to me first. Carol didn't know what to say. Luckily, Mrs. Anderson didn't wait to hear her reaction. Did we hire Carol? Wally pouted, which only made his pale wrinkles deepen. Nobody tells me anything. Mike touched Carol's arm. Welcome to the North Pole. I've got one more meeting before lunch. He began walking toward the office behind the counter. She gets lunch, too? Wally settled deeper in his recliner. The mail came already, Michael. Stuart spun around and wheeled his way to the sales counter, where a stack of mail sat. He handed Mike a thick pile of envelopes. I sorted it for you. Bills. He handed him a smaller stack. Junk. And then a single envelope. And a letter from a college. I wasn't sure what that was. Mike hesitated a bit too long before answering. It's a donation receipt. Carol knew sixth graders who could lie more convincingly than Mike. His dad bought it, though. Of course. You donate to college football programs. Stuart smiled at Carol, a big friendly grin unlike the more guarded expressions Mike made. Your friend Carol will appreciate your charitable contributions. Mike has such good qualities. I'm not sure what we'd do without him. He takes care of us. And I run the yard. Mike walked toward the office once more. I run the yard, Stuart grumbled. Always have. I suppose I'm chopped liver. Wally turned up the television. Carol followed Mike into his tiny office. It barely had enough room for a desk. There were no Christmas decorations here, other than a copy of the print of the snow globe they'd stared at for hours in the ER. Mike's copy wasn't framed. Mike grabbed a clipboard hanging from the wall behind his desk, unclipped the manila folder and put the letter from the college inside. He secured it all back together and hung the clipboard from its nail. So, you donate to colleges. That's a nice way of giving back. Yep. Mike gave her a look that was most unwelcome. I'm really awesome. He stared at her, really stared at her. Not with a glower. Not with a frown. But with a puzzled look on his face. Funny, I don't remember you being so ornery? He shook his head, still considering. Pushy? Mike settled on, confident. Nice save. Carol's stomach growled again. She gestured to the snow globe print. That looks familiar. His gaze stuck on it. My mom bought that the week before she died. She had a snow globe collection, too. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Mike looked at her once more. Me, too. A bell rang over the front door. J.B. Montgomery stepped inside. He was one of the most successful builders in the area. He had salt and pepper hair, and a physique that proved he didn't leave all the manual labor to his employees. He liked to build neighborhoods that looked like they'd been built 100 or more years ago. This'll take a few minutes. Mike walked out, shutting the office door behind him. The clipboard with the letter he'd received fell from the wall. Carol picked it up, hesitating to put it back. She was curious. The door was half glass, so Carol could see out. Mike stood near JB, both men standing tall and proud of their accomplishments. Mike wouldn't want her in his business. Put the clipboard back, Carol. That inner voice, it had always been smart and wholesome, obeying the rules. Carol wasn't feeling smart or wholesome. Her students had taken advantage of her. That made her stupid. She sat in Mike's desk chair, stiffening her spine. A glance up revealed a clear view of the counter where Stuart was greeting JB. She kept the clipboard in her lap and slid the manila folder free. The folder contained a stack of letters and the envelope he'd received today. The return address was Drexel University in Philadelphia, specifically admissions. Admissions? But, he was 28. Put the clipboard back, Carol. She didn't. She rifled through the rest of the letters, all of which had been taken out of their envelopes. It was a thick stack. All acceptance letters from colleges and universities around the country, some as old as 10 years ago. If Mike had been accepted at college every year since high school, why hadn't he gone? Chapter 6. Mike. How the heck are you, man? JB gripped Mike's shoulder instead of his hand, which happened to be in a cast in a sling. I heard about the stage collapse. Mike rolled his shoulders back. Apparently, there's a leak in the storage unit none of us knew about. We'll get it fixed after lunch. Carol was in Mike's office sitting in his chair, watching them. Dad and Grandpa Wally were at the front counter, watching them. Mike didn't know why JB had requested a meeting, but he didn't want an audience. Mike grabbed his jacket and led JB outside, wrapping his coat around him like a cloak. The wind nipped at his face and ears. Have you made a decision on the contract? Instead of answering, JB asked a question of his own. How long are you going to be on injured reserve? Mike tried hard not to frown. I could have broken both arms and we'd still make good on that contract. The deal required them to deliver wood in late March or early April. How long? JB's eyes narrowed, as if he was calculating a difficult word problem. I'm in the sling for the holiday and then it's a few weeks in a cast. He avoided saying the exact duration of his recovery since JB seemed to find this discouraging. I find it discouraging. I need a reliable supply of lumber. JB's posture was as rigid as his tone. The key to keeping costs down during a build is to minimize work disruptions. My last lumber supplier screwed me over and I had to lay guys off for weeks to keep within my budget. He gestured to Mike's wrist. I worried you wouldn't be able to deliver the lumber with just you and your grandfather. And now, I was going to hire someone if we closed the deal, Mike reassured him with a half-truth. He planned to hire someone part-time. North Pole Lumber can handle the job, JB. And I'll be fine long before you break ground at spring thaw. I've been in business a long time. JB studied Mike for a moment. I've learned to trust my instincts. And my instinct is to hold off. I'm going to wait to make a decision until after the new year. Frustration pounded bent nails in Mike's gut. In my mind, Mike said, drawing on some of the bravado Carol seemed to associate with him. We're shaking hands on the deal. JB headed for the stairs. We'll talk after the holidays. Mike went back inside, silently cursing his broken bone. Well? Dad asked. Still under consideration. The words hurt to say. Carol was sitting at his desk, her chin in her hands, staring at him as if she'd never seen him before. You could do worse than Carol DeMerritt, Dad said, noting the direction of his gaze. She's not staying past the holidays. Mike didn't deny the attraction. She's not planning on staying, Dad said sagely. There's a difference. Shouldn't you be getting that plywood out to the stage? Grandpa Wally asked. Yep. Mike recruited Carol to help carry the wood to the truck, loading it in on top of a tarp, which they used to cover it. She came back for the can of paint and roller. While she put that in the truck, Mike went into his office to get his tool bag. A small red felt Christmas stocking with white felt trim rested on top of his file cabinet. Who else but Carol could have left it? He picked the stocking up. It jingled softly and then clanked. Curious, Mike reached inside. There was a small square of paper with red and white stripes. On it, someone had written in green felt pen, "You'll find whatever you need away from home." He crumpled the piece of paper and threw it in the trash. Carol must have been snooping around in his college acceptance folder. She didn't realize he couldn't leave. Mike hurried outside. The sleeve of his jacket flapped in the biting wind. When he was buckled in the truck, Carol backed it out of the yard. You've been accepted to college. I believe opening someone else's mail is a federal offense. He couldn't keep the anger out of his voice. She tried to make her students achieve better lives, and now she was trying with him. Your admissions envelope fell out of the clipboard. I didn't have to open anything. She turned onto Garland Lane, grinding second gear. You were accepted at MIT. Mike turned to stare out the window. That was a long time ago. Why do you keep applying? I don't know. He didn't. It was stupid. Every spring, he ponied up admissions money and submitted for the winter term. I do. She gave him a sideways glance. You keep applying because you want to go. Wanting doesn't mean I can. By the way, I don't think this situation needs fixing. I wasn't thinking about how to help you. She did a better job of finding third gear, although they bounced into it. You're old enough to make your own choices. Oh, please. I was the star quarterback. I was supposed to be going places. Why didn't you go to college? She slowed for the bend near Reindeer Meadow. Bad grades? Arrest record? Deep, dark secret? No, he could feel his scowl etching itself on his face. My brother Greg was due to finish college the year after I graduated high school. He was supposed to come back and help at the yard because by then Dad might have had a better handle on how to live life in a wheelchair. Why didn't Greg return? He fell in love with a girl in Boston. Mike shrugged. She didn't want to leave the city. And then I decided college wasn't that important. And yet, you have an acceptance letter folder. It's stupid. A waste of money. He wished she'd let it go. She didn't. What were you going to study? Here's the crazy part. He turned to look at her. I wanted to be a rocket scientist. You know, working for NASA to build stuff they launch into space. You always did do well with math and science. I say go for it. She'd obviously lost her mind. The 2 in my age is for 28, not 12. It's too late. People reinvent themselves at any age. 28 is better than 68. Oh, come on. I'm not one of your starry-eyed students who dreams of a better life. Well, he wasn't one of her students. That much was true. Besides, NASA isn't making too many rockets anymore. It's all commercial. Meaning there are still jobs, just not government jobs. She slanted him a glance. Your family will be fine on their own. You could hire somebody to help out and come back on weekends. He leaned toward her. You really haven't changed. You're still the same Pollyanna you were in high school, believing anything can happen if people work together. She didn't say anything. Cat got your tongue? You're not even humming. Mike couldn't seem to keep the snap out of his voice. Are you thinking about Mrs. Anderson's offer? She swallowed and said in a small voice, I don't think I could leave my students. The hoodlums? They didn't deserve her. His glance drifted to her full lips. Who was Mike kidding? He didn't deserve her either. They aren't criminals. Don't say things like that. You're angry because your life didn't turn out the way you wanted it to. She was right. But Mike didn't see any way to live other than this one. I'll help you fix the stage as soon as I get something to eat. Carol found a parking spot a few blocks away from Posey's and the town square. Her stomach felt as if it was caving in on itself, while her heart felt twisted and torn. Half felt full just by being with Mike. The other felt broken because her mother might not live to see another holiday season. Food and then we work. That's a promise. Unlike his brother's word. You won't get any argument from me. The snow kept falling, piling on drifts made by snow plows earlier in the day. Fixing the stage wouldn't be easy. But if they didn't fix it and get the stage covered with a waterproof tarp, more boards would weaken, making the stage dangerous. Despite the snow, the town wasn't shut down. Carol and Mike worked their way through the smaller than normal crowd of smiling holiday shoppers carrying brightly colored bags sprouting wrapped presents, curly ribbon bows, and tissue. A group of Holly Scouts spilled out of the teapot carrying steaming cups and giggling as they passed a trio of boys their age. Chloe Lincoln juggled apples in the middle of the closed plowed street surrounding the town square. Buying a bag of Lincoln apples to make pie was a holiday tradition in Christmas Town. Carol and Mike passed timeless antiques and collectibles. Carol paused, her eye caught on the display of snow globes in the window. If she was buying Mike a gift, which she wasn't, a snow globe would be perfect, a way to pay tribute to his mother a decade after her passing. Mike realized Carol wasn't next to him and turned. She smiled reassuringly, and hurried to catch up. She took his arm. The last thing this man needed was to fall again. She thought she heard him sigh, but when she glanced up, he was smiling at her. Once inside Posey's diner, they were seated immediately. Without all the decorations, Posey's diner would have looked like any other average, dated diner. Red booths lined the walls and windows. Mismatched tables were scattered in between the counter and the booths. White Formica tabletops. Swivel stools. It would have been nothing special, if not for Posey. The proprietress waved them toward a booth beneath the front windows. The red-headed 60-something had boundless energy and a love of holidays, all holidays. She jam-packed the diner with holiday decorations. The ceiling fans didn't twirl. Their blades served as arms to hang garlands and hold stuffed animals, which were crammed together and wired in place. Shelves lined the walls, also chock full of holiday cheer, sparkly snowflakes, twinkle lights, plastic red cardinals, sock snowmen, yarn dolls, strings of popcorn, and so much more. And somewhere in all the trimmings, Elmer the elf was hidden, waiting to be discovered. And the one who discovered him? They got a free piece of pie and the right to hide Elmer somewhere else. Carol glanced around. Elmer was never an easy find, but this wasn't Carol's first Elmer rodeo. Do you need a hint? Mike's smile was indulgent, yet sly. He'd already spotted the elf. Don't tell me. That's cheating. She delayed looking at the menu, despite being hungry. We rarely came to Posey's when I was a kid. It was too expensive for us, too, Mike admitted. Greg took out all kinds of student loans to get through college, even with my parents' help. I tried to get academic scholarships, but a lot of schools only offered me a full ride for football, which he'd never get at age 28. Carol reached for his hand, needing to touch him so he'd know she cared that his dreams hadn't worked out. I don't think I slept a wink in college. I was either in class or studying or working. She wanted him to go back, but it was an exhausting experience to go full-time and pay as you went. And she also wanted to find that elf. She withdrew her hand. You can go back, but you'll be drinking a lot of caffeine. I'm not going back. He sank into the booth seat. Tell me why you decided not to be a nun. No, there were too many people in posies who might hear. It was a man, wasn't it? Some guy changed your mind. She could not look at him. He chuckled. We'll talk later, then. When we're alone. Alone? She stopped looking for Elmer, her gaze flying to Mike's face. He was grinning like he had a secret she didn't know about. That grin. It made her cheeks feel like a burning Yuletide log. Did you hit your head during the accident this morning? She knew he hadn't, but how else to explain his expression? You mean our accident? His grin seemed less bright. Or maybe the light caught the stubble on his chin when it came up a notch. Regardless, his eyes burned into hers. Her breath moved in and out as slow as a mid-morning tide. It was safer looking for Elmer. She dragged her eyes away. Mike kept talking. I've been thinking, there was something bright red behind a display of white polar bears. Carol gasped. 2 children in the booth next to them heard her. She caught their attention and directed their gazes toward Elmer's hiding place. We found Elmer, the little boy cried. Pie pie pie. His younger sister clapped her hands. Carol settled in the booth and opened the menu. The day's special was clipped on the inside. Turkey pot pie with biscuit crust. It sounded delicious. But, Mike pointed to the young boy and girl. Carol shrugged. I don't need elf bounty pie. It's enough that the kids found him. Posy came over and hugged Carol. She wore reindeer earrings with red noses that blinked. I still remember the time you sat with me after I got my hip replaced. You must be the worst poker player ever. She walked toward the door and a new group of customers, calling over her shoulder, a slice of peppermint pie will be coming after your meal. Mike leaned forward, an appreciative glint in his eye. You knew Posy would give you a free piece of pie. She had. What she hadn't known, what she hadn't expected, was the way Mike looked at her, as if this was the year Carol's dream was going to come true and he'd ask her for a kiss beneath the gazebo on the town square. There was a better chance of Mike going to MIT than him kissing her. After the waitress took their order, Mike sat back in the booth, looking tired. Tell me about this boy who kissed the idea of being a nun out of your mind. He didn't know it had been him. Carol stared out the window. The snow was still coming down. Must be nearly 3 feet on the stage now. There's no way that conversation would go well for me. But it'd be a fun way to pass the time. His grin made her want another kiss. Carol loosened the scarf around her neck. You'd hang that over my head, the same way you did Merry Christmas Carol. He straightened, suddenly serious. I never called you that, not after that one time. But others did. She was sorry she'd brought it up. It made her seem petty and weak. Reindeer games, and all. And I bet you took it with the same good grace you took me yelling at you the night my mom died. He reached for his water glass. You told me to fight back my grief the way I used to fight on the football field. It looks like you did. He nodded. That's what you need to do with those students you care so much about. Carol couldn't answer. If you care so much, you need to fight for them. His gaze wouldn't let hers go. It was as if they'd been close for years. It felt as if he knew her that well. You won't be able to let them go without a fight. If you do, you won't be able to sleep at night. He was right. But would she sleep any easier if she knew she hadn't been in Christmas Town to support her mother through her final hours? Chapter 7. Nick and Sam had answered Mike's SOS call and helped clear the stage after lunch, put the new board in place, and cover it with a tarp. Painting would have to wait. The snow just kept on coming. Carol drove Mike back to the lumber yard where she helped him clear room in the warehouse for a delivery that Mike knew wouldn't come. No deliveries would be made or received in this weather. Selfishly, Mike hadn't told Carol that. If he had, she'd have gone on to help someone else. Not the most exemplary behavior for the holiday season. But Mike needed more time to figure out whose kiss had changed Carol's life plan. He'd like to suspect it had been him, but that couldn't be. Carol swept the area they'd cleared with a push broom, humming White Christmas. When she turned, Mike stood in her path. Do you regret it? Her gray eyes widened and she whispered, regret what? Not being a nun. No, she glanced at his mouth, blushing furiously. It had been him. Pride made Mike stand taller. Then I won't apologize for kissing you and changing your future. He wrapped his good arm around Carol and pulled her close. The broom clattered to the concrete. Carol didn't resist his embrace. How did you know? I must have given something away in a moment of weakness. You make me a little weak in the knees. It was the truth. He was going to have to figure out how to do long-distance relationships, because he didn't want to let this special woman slip through his fingers a second time. Or was this the third time? Don't look up. Why not? Her hands drifted up around his neck. Because I'm going to tell you we're standing beneath the mistletoe. Mike knew what Carol had missed out on in high school: young romance, stolen kisses. He wanted things to be romantic for her. Now and forever. There is no mistletoe, she said in a matter-of-fact voice, but she was smiling shyly. I can't put anything past you. He drew her closer and lowered his head. I might just as well admit it. I'm going to kiss you. It's about time. Carol rose up on her toes and closed the distance between them. Mike's heart pounded as he deepened the kiss, feeling the promise of forever in their embrace. She was everything he wanted in a woman. Smart, caring, strong, a sense of humor. She understood that her needs and his sometimes had to come after the needs of others. She was beautiful inside and out. Her small hand felt right in his. She felt right in his arms. She was everything that had been missing in his life these past 10 years. He wished the Christmas holiday could last forever. Carol would never go back to Philadelphia. He'd have plenty of time to make a future for himself. They'd learn to love each other. He'd expand the house, building them a private master suite. They'd kiss beneath the gazebo and make plans for a wedding, something big and special, because Carol deserved the princess treatment. Bells were ringing, buzzing more like. Is this what it feels like to realize love? Mike thought he heard his name. Carol pushed back. Mike. He opened his eyes and smiled at her, imagining what it would be like to wake up every morning with her at his side. Your dad. Carol pointed to a corner of the warehouse. He's paging you over the intercom. What happened? Near tears, Carol rushed in the hospital room to see her mother. Her phone had been tucked in her snowsuit and she hadn't heard it ring. Sue had finally tracked Carol down at the lumber yard. Lynn had been admitted to the hospital. How is she? Carol asked. Mike hung back in the doorway, feeling as if he didn't belong. Lynn DeMerritt's skin was gray and her eyes lackluster. Her small frame looked smaller still when surrounded by machines that pumped and measured and warned. But the oddest thing about Lynn's appearance was her expression. She wasn't smiling. Lynn always smiled. She's dehydrated. Sue wasn't smiling either. She sat on the other side of the bed and held her twin's hand. She went all out at bookies and forgot to take care of herself. Mother. Carol stood rigidly at her mother's bedside. Is this why you didn't want me to take time off? Because you were going to work your way into an early grave? Carol's voice cracked. Dying? Mike came to Carol's side, hoping it wasn't true. There wasn't just sadness in Carol's gray eyes, there was resignation. Lynn's dying. In all their conversations today, Carol hadn't mentioned this. He'd thought they'd had meaningful discussions. And that kiss. Carol glanced up at him and in her eyes he saw the truth. She didn't want to face this. He couldn't blame her. But she wouldn't face it alone, not if he had any say in things. Mike took hold of Carol's hand, wanting to comfort, wanting to strengthen. Wanting more than anything for Lynn to jump out of that bed, wear silly clothes and say silly things. He knew how hard it was to lose a mother. He knew how you'd think grief was beaten only to have it rise up again without warning and cut you off at the knees. I thought when a person was in the hospital you were supposed to cheer them up, Lynn grumbled, frowning at her twin. All I've been getting are lectures. Sue sniffed and wiped at her eyes. Because we love you, you idiot. Mike wasn't close to his brother Greg, but he could imagine how Sue would feel if she lost her twin. They did everything together. This would devastate her. When I was growing up, I had a set of house rules. Carol's voice was as grim as a big lump of coal in a child's stocking. It's time you had a set of rules, young lady. Here. Sue brightened. From now on, you'll do as we say. Pfft, Lynn stared at the ceiling. And then her gaze dropped to Mike and Carol's joined hands, and she smiled weakly. There'll be a different set of house rules someday soon. Mike was heartened to find a silver lining. That look of Lynn's was practically a blessing. Excuse me. A nurse knocked on the door. She held a red flower arrangement in a ceramic sleigh. When Lynn DeMerritt gets admitted, she gets a door prize. How lovely, Lynn murmured without having looked at it. She was still staring at Mike and Carol's hand clasp. The perfect Christmas gift. Oh, great, Sue mumbled. My sister gets rewarded for bad behavior. The nurse brought the bouquet in and set it on the bedside table. She kissed Lynn's cheek and smoothed her hair. I bet by morning there'll be so many flowers in here we won't be able to find you to take your vitals. She's staying overnight? Carol's voice sounded brittle. Hence the room. Sue was gloomier than Eeyore on a rainy day. Just for observation, the nurse reassured them and then left. Carol. Lynn reached for her daughter, but she smiled at Mike. Do you know why I named you Carol? Because I was born on Christmas. The sarcasm in Carol's voice was dialed up to 15 on a 10-point scale. Because I couldn't stop singing with joy when I learned I was pregnant. Lynn's gaze finally turned to her daughter. For years, you were the reason for a Merry Christmas, even when I had little to celebrate. Sue nodded, wiping her eyes again. You never complained when I kept you out of recreational soccer so we could visit the elderly at Over the River on Saturdays. You never complained when I made you work the soup kitchen on Thanksgiving. The more Lynn talked, the angrier Mike got. Had she robbed Carol of every childhood joy? Forget romance, Mike wanted to give Carol a normal life. You had a heart bigger than mine and a smile that didn't discriminate, Lynn was saying. You will always be my Merry Christmas, Carol. Sue sobbed and half-hugged her sister. Lynn stroked her sister's wild hair, but she wasn't done. I don't want you to hang around town, waiting for me to go. You need to continue changing lives. Carol stood unmoving for several moments, during which time Mike struggled to hold back a hearty, what the heck. If he'd known his mother was going to die, he'd have dropped out of school to savor every last moment. If that's what you want. Carol backed away from the bed, bumping into Mike. She let go of his hand and fled the room. Carol? That was Sue, not Lynn. She'd raised her tear-stained face from her sister's shoulder. Lynn, you've gone too far this time. I haven't. Lynn stared at Mike. I want my daughter to know how to prioritize love and goodness. Mike didn't say a word. He couldn't, because arguing with a dying woman was always a losing battle. Besides, Carol needed him. Chapter 8. I don't want to go to the town square, Carol repeated for what felt like the 10th time. If you're meeting someone here, I can walk home. The cold would be a welcome balm to her mother's rejection. She'd driven the lumberyard truck from the hospital, grinding gears and jumping curbs, reluctantly parking downtown once more, because Mike had insisted. Hey. Mike grabbed her hand. Hold up and talk to me. No, she hadn't said a word the entire drive over. I should have told you to wait outside the room. Because he'd heard her mother. He'd heard Mom discharge Carol as if she was a recruit in a rebellion, not a daughter who should be there for her mother. Carol felt insignificant and unloved. The snow was falling. The sun was sinking. And everything about Carol's life was collapsing. Come on. Mike tugged her toward the town square. It was snowing. Lights were blinking on up and down the snowy streets. The Victorian singers sounded as if they were a block over, singing Carol of the Bells. It was beautiful. Carol didn't want beautiful. She wanted dark. She wanted silence. She wanted to curl in on herself and rue her non-normal life. Slow down. You're going to fall. She glanced up. The snowy green was emptier than it had been last night while they built the stage. People were only in one place, the gazebo. Her blood ran hot and then cold. Mike, what are you doing? Mike continued to tug her toward the dwindling line of lovers at the gazebo. You grew up here. You know what I'm doing. Carol's heels couldn't find purchase. He kept dragging her forward. They'd been here earlier in the day. He could have kissed her then. He hadn't. He was taking her to the gazebo because her mother had basically cut her free and Mike wasn't one to leave so much as an orphaned kitten out in the cold. Mike, I don't want you to take me on as another one of your responsibilities. Not that he could. She was leaving town after the holiday. Maybe before, if the roads cleared. What was the point in staying? Mike's boots crunched a path in the snow. There was only one more couple beneath the gazebo. Across the square, Santa was giving one last merry ho-ho-ho. Mike, I want you to have a chance at your dreams. Carol tried to dig in her heels once more. I want you to go back to school. You can't do that while you take care of your family and she couldn't bring herself to say the word wife. What if he just wanted to kiss her to prove that someone cared for her? That someone was willing to go the extra mile for her? If that's all he was doing, her heart would break, as sharply as the holiday ball Wally had dropped earlier. They reached the end of the line. Or, since the couple ahead of them giggled and ran off, they were at the front of the line. Carol. Mike turned to her. His grip was strong and the look in his brown eyes determined. This was her dream. Mike Hopkins leading her to the gazebo for a kiss. But there was nothing romantic about what they were doing. This had pity written all over it, with a capital P. We're alike, he said. We understand each other. We can't stop ourselves from helping others. Why wouldn't we risk a little kiss under the gazebo? Because, Carol had to swallow twice before she could say it, and then only in a whisper. Because we don't love each other? He drew back as if she'd slapped him. And then he leaned forward and pressed a tender kiss to her forehead. Or is it that we haven't had time to say the words? Carol's breath caught in her throat. The way he looked at her, She could almost believe the burst of emotion in her chest. The one that made her want to both laugh and cry was love. I couldn't stop thinking about you when you offered me comfort in the waiting room all those years ago. He stroked his thumb over the back of her hand. Beneath her glove, she imagined she felt a trace of warmth in the trail of his touch. I couldn't stop thinking about you after I kissed you on New Year's Eve. He drew her hands to his chest. But I thought you couldn't take me seriously. Such a foolish, tender-hearted man. Carol gripped his hands tighter. I don't care what your mother says. His gaze had captured hers. His heart had captured hers. She needs you. Come back to Christmas Town. Take that job Mrs. Anderson offered you. Help your mother face this final chapter in her life and help me write a chapter for us. Carol's heart fell to the frozen ground. Mom doesn't want me here. But your Aunt Sue does. I do. He took a step toward the gazebo. Your mother is just like those students of yours. They may not want your help, but they need it. He was right. He was so very right. Except, those kids need a champion, Mike. I can't just quit on them the way you did on your dream of going to college. He stiffened, his expression turning cold. His hold on her hand became just as icy. My father needed me more than I needed 4 years of partying. She freed one hand and laid it on his cheek. You wouldn't have partied. You would have been a superstar on field and off. It's not important now. He removed her hand from his face. Carol wanted to crumple into a heap at his feet. But that wasn't the DeMerritt way. It is. Or you wouldn't continue to apply for college if it didn't. She took a step back from him, thinking of Blue Christmas, and all the Blue Christmases to come. My mother told me to choose something to fight for other than her. What would your father say if you asked him? Mike's gaze turned vacant. It was clear to her. He didn't know. I'm sorry, Mike. I can't change who I am. Those warm brown eyes found her gaze. Even if you didn't choose to be that person? You heard your mother. She didn't let you be a kid. He raised a hand toward Carol, but she stepped out of reach. I'd let you choose what's important to you, Carol. I'd let you choose family first, if that's what you wanted. His hand swept toward the gazebo. I could love you. Here, she added for him. You could love me here in Christmas Town and try to forget what's important to you in here. Carol tapped her chest. Love is a balance. I don't want to be the one who drags down your scales. Dad? Mike closed the front door behind him and was enveloped by the sights and smells of home. His father cooked at a low stovetop built into a cut-down cabinet, the one Mike had modified so he could make meals while in his chair. Today was spaghetti day. The smell of tomato sauce and garlic permeated the air. Grandpa Wally was resting in the recliner behind a newspaper, snoring softly. This was Mike's life. He wasn't sending rockets to the moon. He was helping people build houses and making sure everyone who wanted to celebrate in Christmas Town had a wonderful time. What is it, Michael? Dad stirred the noodles. What's bothering you? Mike crossed the living room into the kitchen, unwilling to sugarcoat it. I've been accepted into college. That's great. Dad laid his wooden spoon in the spoon rest. Which one? All of them. Mike confessed his decade-long process. But, son, you could have gone off to college years ago. His father frowned. I'm assuming I'm the reason you didn't go. You know, his voice hardened. I can take care of myself. Me, too, Grandpa Wally said, folding his newspaper. We can take care of each other, Dad said firmly. There's a service I can call to pick me up and take me to the doctor. Sue told me the grocer delivers again. Grandpa Wally lowered his footrest. What's old is new again. My mother used to get a box of groceries delivered. If you want to go to college, you should. Dad touched Mike's arm. But what about Carol? Mike couldn't admit she'd rejected him. The words stuck in his throat. Whose stocking is this? Grandpa Wally shook the red stocking Mike had found in his office. It jingled. He reached inside and withdrew a small sheet of red and white paper and squinted at it. I can't quite read it. It says, you'll find whatever you need away from home. How had Carol gotten it inside the house? It doesn't. Grandpa Wally walked into the kitchen and thrust it toward Mike. I think it says to follow your heart. Now, I know these stockings turn up from time to time and I'm not one to believe in myths and superstitions, usually. Mike took the sheet of paper, confirming that it did indeed say, follow your heart. But I did kiss your grandmother on Christmas Eve under the gazebo. He sat down at the kitchen table. And that was one bit of holiday magic that I was happy to claim. I proposed to your mother under the gazebo, Dad said quietly. I was hoping to propose to someone else one day. Mike recalled his father looking at Sue with love in his eyes. He laid a hand on his father's shoulder. Lynn's dying, Dad. He hoped Sue let his father fill the void Carol hadn't let Mike fill. His father's eyes brimmed with tears. Are you sure? Mike nodded. I know what you're thinking. Dad drew a deep breath. I wasn't banking on Sue when I told you we'd be fine. He patted Mike's hand. When it comes down to it, I hope I can be the blessing to the DeMerritt family that Lynn was to ours. You will, Dad. Mike bent and hugged him, thinking about magic stockings and magic traditions, and the power of love to fill a soul and heal. Carol? Aunt Sue knocked softly on Carol's bedroom door, not waiting for an answer before opening it. She looked pale, wrung out in a wrinkled navy track suit, gray-brown hair flying with static. Your mother's getting out at 5 this afternoon. The doctor said her blood counts are good. Finally, Carol had been reading Christmas at the comfort food cafe. She set her book down and tugged at her red and green leggings. It had been 3 days since Carol had let Mike go. 2 days since her mother had freed Carol of any obligation. She'd cried. She'd done what little Christmas shopping she had on her list and wrapped her gifts. She should have left town. She couldn't seem to. She always spent her birthday in this house. Lynn said to come back at 5:30 because they're always late. Aunt Sue's eyes sparkled. You'll never guess who is picking her up with me. Stuart Hopkins. She shook her head. Mom will enjoy breaking out of there on Christmas Eve and seeing the pageant with you too. Carol smiled for Aunt Sue, thinking of Mike and wondering if he'd go to the pageant. He hadn't come by or tried to call, nor had she tried to get in touch with him. Carol imagined Mike's heart was smarting just as much as hers was. Lynn will enjoy the spectacle. Sue perched on the arm of the sofa. You know I'll always be here for you. I enjoy volunteering and I'm not going to stop when. She somehow managed a smile. It was always your mother's passion. Carol nodded. A bit of red caught her eye. The felt stocking was on the arm of the sofa, the same as it had been the day she'd arrived. She picked it up. It jingled. I thought I put this in the closet. She held it up for Aunt Sue to see. Aunt Sue gasped and color splashed onto her cheeks. It's one of those so-called magic stockings. Your mother used to put them in my room every Christmas. How did she get that here? Carol let the stocking fall to her lap. Mom did this? Yes. And there'd always be some fortune cookie-like saying inside. Aunt Sue winked. You know, fortune cookie fortunes are generic for a reason. They can apply to anyone. Carol knew all about the myth of the stockings in Christmas Town. But unlike Aunt Sue, she'd never received one before. And this one hadn't been on the sofa earlier. Go on, Aunt Sue urged. Reach inside. Let's see what your mother has to say this year. Carol reached inside and pulled out another piece of red and white paper. This one had a different message written in green felt pen, go to the gazebo at 5. She showed it to Aunt Sue. That sounds like Mom, all right. So determined that Carol find someone. The stocking jingled once more. Carol and Aunt Sue exchanged looks. It was empty. Carol handed it to her aunt. You look this time. Aunt Sue reached in, producing a similar scrap of red and white paper. She'll be back in 4 years. Sue gasped and dropped the stocking. She gave Carol a guilty look. It's about you. I've been dreading you leaving. Carol shook her head. This is weird. The stocking jingled again. Carol got to her feet and stared at the stocking as if it was a spider who'd crawled unexpectedly into view. Was it empty when you put your hand in there? Yes, Aunt Sue whispered. You don't think, she clutched her chest. What if Lynn's gone and this is her? Carol felt as if too many strands of garland had been wrapped around her chest and the knots were being pulled. Call the hospital. Aunt Sue did. Mom was fine. Her aunt stood in the doorway, pale once more. All those stockings, all those years, they might not have been from Mom. Carol still hadn't touched the stocking. It jingled as if impatient. All right, all right. She picked up the stocking. It felt heavy. She thrust her hand inside. Her fingers found something round and smooth. She pulled out a small snow globe with the Christmas Town gazebo inside. She held it toward Aunt Sue. That was definitely not there before. Aunt Sue peered at it. There's a couple kissing. The woman has a tan coat, like you do. And the man's is deeper brown, like Mike's. Carol shook her head. She didn't want Christmas Town magic to toy with her heart. She set the stocking and snow globe on the couch cushion. He wants me to stay. She'd discussed this with Aunt Sue. But 4 years, Aunt Sue bent to peer at the snow globe again. Mike could get a degree in 4 years. They'd talked about his college applications. And you could make a difference at that school of yours. Carol swallowed thickly. It was a good compromise. Let's just say for sake of argument that Mike's decided to leave his dad here alone. Nobody's alone in Christmas Town. Aunt Sue blushed. Well, there was a romance in the making. Regardless, Carol shook her head. Mom wouldn't want me to leave those kids in South Philly. Ever. Your mother is prouder of you than her pride will let her say. Aunt Sue straightened and sharpened her tone. There were times when I had to tell her I couldn't volunteer anymore. I needed a break. Time to recharge. She understood. She hugged Carol. You can't live your life the way Lynn did, but you can make her proud all the same. The truth of it washed over Carol. Her breath caught in her throat. I have to go to the town square. It's almost 5. Carol couldn't believe it. She was giving love a chance based a Christmas town myth. She only hoped it wasn't too late. Carol ran as best she could in her snow boots to the town square, working her way through the crowds. The snow had finally eased yesterday and the crowds had returned en masse. She stopped in front of the teapot and scanned the dwindling line of couples at the gazebo. It was 5 after. Mike was nowhere to be seen. The opening strains of music began to play on the stage. The pageant was beginning. Her heart fell. Carol? Mike stood at the door to the teapot without his sling on, looking the way Carol felt as if love had passed him by. Mike. She ran into his arms, being careful not to bump his injured wrist. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. She pressed a kiss to his cold cheek. Me, too. And then he was kissing her the way he had on New Year's Eve 10 years ago. Wait, oh, wait. Carol broke off the kiss. I don't have to be who my mother wants me to be. Not 24/7. If you can live with me volunteering and trying to save kids, if you can live with me trying to work and attend college. They'd talked over each other. Mike laughed. Carol shed a tear. We can make this work, she said firmly. Carol. Mike pressed his cheek to hers and whispered, for years, you were Lynn's Merry Christmas Carol. But now, I want you to be mine. He was choosing her and she was going to love him, just like the stocking had recommended. I want you to be my Merry Christmas Carol. Children were singing All I Want for Christmas. Carol couldn't see. Tears blurred her vision. But she could feel. She could feel the joy of love blossoming in her chest. She could feel the press of his lips to hers. She could feel their breath mingle and their hearts beat as one. She could hear Mike ask if she wanted a kiss beneath the gazebo. She could feel her head nod in assent. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was a Merry Christmas Carol.